The world seemed to hold its breath as the sound of the gunshot cracked through the stillness. The sharp, deafening noise ripped through the quiet suburban street, echoing against the houses that once felt so safe. Jake's heart stopped, his breath caught in his chest as he saw his daughter, Carly, crumple to the ground in a lifeless heap. Time seemed to slow as he rushed toward her, his every step a blur. Blood pooled beneath her fragile body, staining the pavement in a horrifying splash of red. The silence that followed was even worse than the shot itself. Sophie, Carly's mother, let out a scream that shook the very air, her voice raw with terror and disbelief. Her knees hit the ground beside her daughter as she tried desperately to rouse her, to make the impossible seem real. But Carly didn't move. The cruel finality of it all was too much to bear. Karen stood just a few feet away, her hand still trembling from the gun she had fired. The expression on her face was not one of remorse, but of cold satisfaction. She had done it. She had taken control once and for all. She'd silenced the family that had dared to stand against her. The officer beside her, still standing with his weapon drawn, looked at her for a moment, then quickly lowered his gaze, unsure of what to do next. But what Karen didn't know, what she couldn't have anticipated in her blind arrogance, was that the family had been recording everything. Every word. Every move. Every second. As Sophie screamed, Jake's shaking hand reached for his phone. The screen flickered as he replayed the footage. Everything had been caught. The entire brutal act, the threats, the cold-blooded shooting, all captured on video. Karen had thought she could get away with it. But the truth was about to come for her in a way she could never escape. The game had just changed. Karen had always been a force to be reckoned with in the neighborhood. The self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, she believed she was above reproach, ruling with a sharp tongue and an even sharper sense of authority. Her world was one of control, of fine-tuned regulations that no one could escape. And if you dared to step out of line, she would make sure you paid. For months, Sophie and Jake had tried to tolerate her presence. They had hoped it would pass, that the constant, petty complaints about their lawn, the mailbox, the color of their house would eventually stop. But it hadn't. At first, it seemed harmless. A letter here and there, a knock at the door from Karen and her ever-present clipboard. She'd accuse them of not trimming the bushes or placing an improper ornament on their porch. At first, they played along, fixing minor things in the hopes it would settle the storm. But Karen's demands only grew more unreasonable. She started making surprise inspections, showing up at the most inconvenient times, demanding that everything be perfect. It didn't stop there. She began to target their daughter, Carly, who had limited mobility. Karen claimed that Carly's special needs equipment, like her ramp and support rails, violated the HOA's so-called aesthetic rules. Sophie had tried to explain, tried to reason with her, but Karen's attitude was unwavering. Every conversation turned into an argument, and every argument felt like it would be the last. Jake, a man who had always prided himself on his patience, started feeling the pressure. The constant harassment was wearing him down. Sophie, too, felt the weight of the tension. They had started documenting Karen's behavior, taking pictures, recording phone calls, even capturing video of the increasingly hostile encounters. They were determined to have proof if things ever escalated beyond Karen's petty power games. But they had no idea how close that moment was. One morning, Karen came to their door again, this time with an officer in tow. The officer, who had been a part of the neighborhood for years, was a familiar face. But today, he looked different, cold, distant, as though Karen had woven her influence over him, too. "I've had enough," Karen snapped as she stormed up the driveway. "This family will not get away with this any longer." Sophie tried to reason with her. "Karen, this is too much. We've already made all the changes you've asked for. Carly needs her ramp to get in and out of the house. This isn't about the neighborhood anymore." But Karen's eyes narrowed, and the smile that curled on her lips wasn't kind. You think I care about your excuses, she said, raising her voice. You've broken the rules, and now it's time to face the consequences. No one is above me. Not you. Not your disabled daughter. Not anyone. Jake stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. We're done with this, Karen. We're not letting you push us around anymore. Karen didn't back down. Her words were venomous. You'll regret this. I'll make sure of it. The officer shifted uneasily beside her, but he didn't intervene. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with the promise of an inevitable clash. Sophie and Jake knew this wouldn't end with another letter. Karen was no longer just an irritant, she had become a threat. She wasn't just trying to intimidate them. She was trying to break them, to prove that no one could stand up to her. As the confrontation continued, the family realized that Karen had gone too far this time. There was no way out. There was no way to appease her, no negotiating. The fight for their home, for their daughter's rights, was about to get ugly. Sophie grabbed her phone, her fingers shaking. She had learned the hard way that when it came to Karen, having proof was the only way to protect themselves. This wasn't the first time Karen had gone too far, Sophie thought, her heart pounding. But this time, there was no backing down. It was a Thursday afternoon when Karen showed up again, and this time, things were different. Jake had barely finished his lunch when he saw her, striding up the driveway with a smirk that sent a cold chill down his spine. But she wasn't alone. The officer, Officer Trent, stood beside her, his arms crossed and his expression hard. He hadn't been this distant before, and his silence was unsettling. Sophie, who had been at the kitchen table, stood up quickly when she saw them approach. She looked at Jake with a mixture of worry and exhaustion. Not again, she whispered, her voice tinged with frustration. Jake nodded but didn't speak. He could feel the tension building inside him. Karen had crossed every line imaginable. The constant harassment, the accusations about Carly's equipment, now it was clear that Karen wasn't just trying to bully them into submission. She wanted control. She wanted to prove that she had the power to destroy anyone who didn't bend to her will. As Karen reached the porch, she didn't even bother to knock. She pushed open the door, striding inside without invitation. I'm done with this nonsense, she spat, her voice sharp as a whip. You think I'm going to let you defy me in front of everyone? You've had enough chances, and now there are consequences. Sophie stepped forward, her tone calm but firm. Karen, we've already fixed the issues you've raised. Carly's ramp is necessary. She needs it to move around. This isn't about aesthetics, and you know it. Karen's eyes narrowed, and she took a step closer, her presence filling the room like an oppressive storm. You think that gives you the right to ignore the rules, she snapped. You've been flaunting your special needs as if it excuses you from following the same rules as everyone else. But it doesn't. And now, I'm here to make sure you understand the consequences. Jake, who had been standing silently at the doorway, couldn't take it any longer. The words burned in his chest. Enough, he shouted, his voice echoing in the small living room. We're done with this. We've tried to be reasonable, but you've pushed us too far. We're not your punching bags. Karen's smirk deepened, and she turned to Officer Trent. You see? This is what happens when people refuse to listen to authority. They get unruly. They think they can challenge me and get away with it. Officer Trent shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flicking between Karen and Jake. He had always been the type to follow orders, but something about this situation felt wrong. Jake's voice rose again. You're not going to bully us into submission anymore. We've had enough. Karen, however, was undeterred. Her voice rose in anger, taking on a dangerous edge. You think you have a choice? You think you're in control? Well, you're not. Not anymore. You'll do what I say, or I'll make sure you regret it. I've already spoken to your neighbors. They know what you're doing, and they're ready to back me up." The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. She had already turned the community against them. But that wasn't the worst part. The officer, Officer Trent, wasn't saying anything. He just stood there, like a silent observer, letting Karen take charge. Sophie looked at him with pleading eyes. "Trent, you can't let her do this. You know this is wrong. You know we're not the ones causing trouble." But Trent didn't move. He didn't even look her in the eye. Karen's grip on him was stronger than ever. She had successfully manipulated him into her corner. Sophie's face tightened, her frustration turning into something more, something dangerous. She stepped forward, ready to confront both Karen and the officer, but Jake reached out and stopped her. "No," he said quietly, his voice steady. "We're not backing down. We have to stand up now, for Carly. For all of us." Karen's eyes gleamed with malicious satisfaction. She had pushed them to their breaking point. She wasn't here to negotiate or talk anymore. She was here to break them, to show them who was in charge. "I warned you," Karen said, her voice low and venomous. "You'll regret this. If you don't fall in line, I'll make sure every inch of your life becomes a nightmare. This is your final warning." The room fell silent, the tension thick and suffocating. Jake's fists clenched at his sides, his heart pounding in his chest. Sophie stood beside him, her expression hardening. They knew now that Karen wasn't just trying to get compliance. She was trying to crush them, to make them powerless. And the officer, the one person who could stand up to her, stood silently by her side, complicit in her abuse of power. The family was trapped. But Jake knew one thing: they had a choice. It wasn't just about surviving this anymore, it was about fighting back. They wouldn't let Karen win. Not this time. As Karen's smug smile faded into a sneer, Jake took a deep breath, his voice low but resolute. "We're not afraid of you, Karen. And we're not afraid of the consequences. Whatever you throw at us, we'll fight back." The air was thick with unspoken promises, the battle lines clearly drawn. The situation was no longer about Karen's petty rules, it was about power, about standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. And Jake and Sophie had made up their minds. They wouldn't back down. They couldn't. The tension in the room had reached a boiling point. Sophie and Jake stood shoulder to shoulder, eyes locked on Karen, who was pacing in front of them, her sharp heels clicking against the floor like the ticking of a bomb. The officer, Trent, stood to the side, his expression unreadable but tense. The whole situation felt wrong, like they were standing at the edge of a cliff, each word and movement pushing them closer to the fall. "I've had enough of this," Karen said, her voice sharp and unwavering. "You think you can keep defying me? You think this is some kind of joke? You're not above the rules. No one is. Not you, not your disabled daughter, none of you." Sophie opened her mouth to respond, but Jake's hand on her shoulder stopped her. He stepped forward instead, trying to remain calm despite the anger simmering inside him. "We're not going to stand down, Karen. We've tried to reason with you, but this is too much. You've pushed us too far." Karen's eyes narrowed as she stopped pacing. She turned slowly to face him, the smirk on her face growing into something colder, more dangerous. "You think you're in control here? You're not. I'm the one with the power. And I've had enough of your insubordination." She turned to Officer Trent, her voice laced with authority. "Trent, take care of them. Make them understand who's in charge." Her words were sharp, almost gleeful in their cruelty. Trent hesitated, his hand twitching at his side. Sophie noticed it first, the brief flicker of doubt in his eyes. She had known Trent for years. He wasn't a bad man, but something had changed. He had been pulled into Karen's web, and it was clear that he wasn't sure where he stood anymore. His hand hovered near his gun, but his gaze kept flicking between Karen and the family, as though searching for a way out. Jake's voice rose in frustration. "Trent, this isn't you. You don't have to do this. Stop her." But Trent's hesitation was short-lived. The grip of fear and pressure from Karen was too strong, and with one swift motion, he unholstered his gun. Sophie's heart stopped. She couldn't believe what was happening. Her breath caught in her chest, and for a brief, terrible moment, the world around her seemed to blur, time stretching out as she watched in horror. Karen was smiling, a cold, satisfied grin, while Jake's face contorted in shock and disbelief. "Stop!" Sophie shouted, stepping forward, her hand reaching for Trent's arm. "Don't do this." But Karen stepped forward, blocking her. "No more talking. No more excuses. It's time to make them understand." She raised her hand toward Trent, who, without another word, pulled the trigger. The sound of the shot was deafening, cutting through the air like a scream. Sophie's blood ran cold as she turned just in time to see Carly, their daughter, fall to the ground, a scream caught in her throat. She saw the way Carly's body crumpled, the blood spilling out beneath her. The world seemed to go still, everything slowing to a crawl as Sophie's mind struggled to process what had just happened. "No!" Jake screamed, running to Carly's side, his hands trembling as he knelt beside her. His fingers searched desperately for a pulse, but it was too late. The blood that soaked into his hands told him everything he needed to know. Carly, their precious daughter, was gone. Sophie's vision blurred with tears, but she fought them back, her heart shattering as she watched Jake hold Carly's lifeless body. The weight of it, the sheer horror of what had just unfolded, crushed her. The person she had trusted, Officer Trent, had just taken their daughter's life. And Karen, the woman who had tormented them for so long, stood there with a cruel smile on her face, her arms crossed like she had won a victory. The air in the room was thick with the stench of fear, anger, and disbelief. Karen stepped closer to them, her heels clicking louder with each step, as if relishing the moment. "Now you understand," she said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "You can't fight me. You never could. You're weak." But as Karen spoke, something inside Sophie snapped. She had watched her daughter die right in front of her, at the hands of this woman who had never shown a shred of humanity. The rage, the grief, it all collided inside her, a tidal wave of emotion that surged to the surface. "Stop!" Jake shouted again, looking up at Karen, his voice hoarse with the pain of what had just happened. He stood up, shaking with fury, his eyes wild as he turned on Karen. "You think you've won? You think this is over? You've just made the biggest mistake of your life." Karen's smirk faltered for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "You'll see. You'll all see. No one can stop me." Sophie stood motionless, her gaze fixed on Karen, but something had changed in her. She was no longer just a victim. She was no longer scared of Karen or anyone else. The anger that boiled inside her had transformed into something else, something far more dangerous. She had to be strong. She had to fight back for Carly, for everything they had lost. As she glanced at Jake, she noticed his hand still gripping his phone. He had been recording everything, every word, every action. The entire incident was on film. The video. The proof. Sophie's voice was low, but filled with determination as she turned to Jake. "We have it. We have everything." Jake's eyes widened in realization. The truth, everything they needed to bring Karen down, had been captured on camera. The world would see what Karen had done. This was far from over. Sophie and Jake would not let Karen's cruelty define their story. They would make sure justice was served. As the reality of the situation settled in, Karen's smug expression turned into a flicker of fear. She had no idea what was coming next. She thought she had won, but the battle had only just begun. The camera had captured the truth, and that truth would be her downfall. Sophie and Jake didn't have their daughter anymore, but they had something that would change everything, something Karen couldn't escape. The air in the room felt thick with a sense of finality as Jake knelt beside Carly's lifeless body, his hands trembling with disbelief. His mind raced, everything was happening so quickly, too quickly to process. His daughter was gone, taken by the cold hand of violence that had shattered their world. Sophie stood frozen, her heart breaking, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. Karen, standing a few feet away, seemed to savor the chaos. She watched them from a distance, her lips twisted into a cruel, self-satisfied grin. The officer, Officer Trent, stood beside her, his face pale, his hands still shaking as if he had just come out of a trance. But Sophie's eyes weren't on Karen or Trent. They were on Jake, who was still kneeling by Carly, his hand still gripping his phone. Suddenly, as if on instinct, Jake's fingers tightened around the phone. He felt the vibration in his hand, something was different. His heart skipped a beat as he looked at the screen. The phone was still recording. His breath caught in his throat. The whole thing, the confrontation, the threats, and the moment of the shooting, had been captured. The video had been running the entire time. The truth, raw and undeniable, was right there in his palm. Sophie's eyes widened as she realized what Jake was looking at. "Jake," she whispered, her voice trembling, "is it?" Jake didn't need to answer. The truth was staring back at them, clear as day. He didn't need to say a word as he held the phone up to her, showing her the screen. There it was, the footage of Karen and Officer Trent. Every second of the confrontation had been documented. The threats, the shooting, everything. Sophie's heart raced. She felt a surge of hope, of power, rush through her. They had proof. Not just their word, but undeniable, irrefutable evidence. In that moment, everything shifted. Karen and Trent had underestimated them. They thought they could get away with this, thought they could crush them, but they hadn't counted on the truth being captured on tape. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut, but it wasn't pain. It was clarity. They had the weapon they needed to fight back, and Karen was about to realize just how wrong she had been. Jake's fingers trembled as he scrolled through the footage, confirming the moments that led to the fatal shot. "We've got everything," he said, his voice thick with a mixture of disbelief and relief. "Every word, every movement. We have it all." Sophie stepped back, her mind spinning. For the first time since the shooting, she felt a sense of control. She wasn't powerless anymore. They had been victims, yes, but now they had the one thing Karen couldn't escape, the truth. Karen's expression faltered. She had been so sure of her victory, so convinced that her power would protect her. But now, as she watched Sophie and Jake huddled over the phone, the expression on her face twisted from satisfaction to something darker. The reality of the situation was sinking in, and with it, the creeping fear that she was no longer in control. Trent, standing silently beside her, seemed to be processing the situation in real time. His eyes darted between Karen and the family, his hand still near his holster. He hadn't anticipated the power of the moment. He had acted on Karen's orders without thinking, but now, the consequences were clear. The evidence was right in front of him, and there was no denying what he had done. Sophie's voice broke the silence. "You've just made the biggest mistake of your life, Karen," she said coldly, her words laced with the calm fury that had been building inside her since the moment Karen first walked into their lives. She wasn't just angry anymore. She was resolute. And as the reality of the situation settled in, Sophie felt something shift inside her. She was no longer the victim. She was the one with the power now. Jake held up the phone for Karen to see. "We have everything you've done on tape. And you're not getting away with it." The weight of those words hung in the air like a promise, a threat, and a declaration all at once. The truth was out. And Karen had no idea what was coming for her next. The video was out. It spread faster than anyone could have anticipated, shared on social media, news outlets running it on a loop, every detail meticulously dissected by a public hungry for justice. The footage was raw, unedited, and unmistakable: Karen's venomous threats, the officer's hesitant steps, and the fatal moment when the gunshot rang out. The world was now watching. At first, the family was overwhelmed by the shock of Carly's death, their grief fresh and raw, but the media blitz and public outcry gave them a renewed sense of purpose. They weren't just fighting for themselves anymore, they were fighting for something larger, a sense of justice that had been ripped away from them. Sophie sat at the kitchen table, staring at her phone, the screen flickering with news alerts. The headlines were bold: the world was taking notice, HOA officer shoots disabled child in cold blood, shocking footage exposes corruption in neighborhood authority. It was as if the world had been waiting for a story like theirs, and now it was impossible to ignore. Jake paced the living room, his hands running through his hair. He couldn't sit still. The video was everywhere, and despite the horror it brought, there was a sense of satisfaction that built in his chest. For the first time, their side of the story was being heard. They had the truth on their side, and that truth was powerful. "I can't believe it's real," Sophie muttered, holding the phone up so Jake could see the headlines. "This is happening. We're not crazy. The world is finally seeing what she's done." Jake nodded, his gaze dark. "We've got to stay calm. It's going to get worse before it gets better. They're going to try to spin this, make it look like something it's not." The police had already launched an investigation, but Sophie could feel the skepticism lingering in the air. Officer Trent, the man who had pulled the trigger, had been placed on administrative leave, but his role in the shooting was still unclear. He hadn't made a statement yet, and Karen? Karen had gone silent, retreating behind her lawyer, but the public wasn't letting her hide for long. Karen, once so confident in her position of power, was now feeling the weight of the backlash. She had underestimated how far the truth would travel. She had thought that her position in the community would protect her, but now her actions were under a microscope. The public outcry was deafening. People had started to dig into her past, previous complaints, accusations of abuse of power. The evidence was stacking up against her, and she was becoming increasingly desperate. At the same time, the police investigation was unfolding, but slowly. The authorities, who had initially been hesitant to take action, were now under pressure from the public to move faster. The footage was damning, but it was still just a piece of the puzzle. They needed to verify every detail, interview witnesses, and, most importantly, determine whether the officer had acted within the law or if Karen had coerced him. Sophie and Jake were now caught in the middle, facing the scrutiny of the media, the police, and Karen's ever-growing defense team. Every move they made was being watched. Some people supported them, flooding their social media with messages of encouragement. Others accused them of manipulating the footage, questioning their motives. Sophie had never felt more exposed in her life. The pressure was mounting. Jake knew they couldn't rely solely on the public outcry or the police investigation. They needed to stay ahead, keep pushing the truth. They had something no one else had, the footage. But they had to be careful. They couldn't afford to make mistakes. Then came the first major blowback. Karen's lawyer issued a statement, dismissing the video as incomplete and misleading. They claimed the footage was edited, that it didn't show the full context of what had happened. According to the lawyer, the officer had acted in self-defense, that he had feared for his life when Jake had gotten too close. Sophie knew it was a lie. She could feel it in her gut. "We need to make sure this footage stays untouched," Jake said, pacing again, his mind spinning. "We can't let them twist the narrative." Sophie nodded, her jaw tight. "I know. But Karen is already trying to make it seem like we're the ones to blame. She's been setting us up all along. I won't let her get away with it." The next day, Karen appeared on TV for the first time since the shooting. She sat on a plush chair, her hair perfectly styled, her expression cold and rehearsed. "This is a tragedy, yes. But there's more to this story. The footage being circulated does not show the full picture," she said, her voice dripping with feigned empathy. "I was forced into a corner, and I had to make a difficult decision. I'm not the villain here. I'm just a concerned citizen trying to protect my community." The public response was immediate. People were outraged, but the damage had already been done. Karen had begun her spin. She was trying to turn the narrative into a battle between her authority and a family that refused to comply. She knew how to manipulate people, how to twist the truth to suit her agenda. But Sophie and Jake weren't going to let that happen. The investigation was just getting started, but the weight of public opinion was already tipping in their favor. Karen thought she could control the narrative, but she had underestimated the power of truth. She had thought the video would fade into the background, but now it was the only thing anyone cared about. The truth was no longer in the shadows, it was front and center, and it wasn't going anywhere. Sophie and Jake shared a look, a wordless understanding passing between them. They were in this together, and they weren't going to back down. They had the truth on their side, and nothing could take that away. The investigation was only the beginning, but Sophie and Jake knew that they had already won one crucial battle. Karen couldn't hide anymore. The world knew what she had done. And the truth would continue to haunt her, no matter how hard she tried to spin it. The courtroom was a sea of faces, every seat filled, and the tension was palpable. The once mundane space now felt suffocating, as if the walls themselves were pressing in on the people who had gathered for the trial. News cameras flashed, capturing every moment for the world to see, and the murmurs of the crowd created a low hum of anticipation. Sophie and Jake sat together, their hands clasped tightly in the silence, their gazes fixed on the front of the room. The faces of the jury, the judge, the prosecutor, everyone was waiting for the final act. The moment that would decide their fate. Karen, sitting in the defendant's chair, was the picture of composure, her sharp suit and perfectly done hair betraying none of the fear that gripped her insides. Her lawyer sat beside her, whispering reassuring words in her ear, but even from where Sophie sat, she could see Karen's hands twitching, betraying the mask of confidence she tried to maintain. Across the room, Officer Trent sat quietly, his eyes cast downward. He had been placed under a microscope, and though he tried to hide it, the weight of what had happened was evident on his face. His role in Carly's death had been undeniable, he had pulled the trigger, but the question remained, was he truly coerced by Karen, or was he complicit in her cruelty? The judge, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, banged his gavel. "Order in the court," he called. The room fell silent. "We will now proceed with the presentation of evidence from the prosecution." Jake and Sophie's lawyer, a calm but determined woman named Linda, stood and approached the podium. She was their rock throughout the proceedings, the one person who had helped them navigate this nightmare. She gave them a reassuring glance before turning to face the jury and the judge. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice clear and unwavering, "what we are about to show you is irrefutable evidence of the crime that took place that day. The video footage you will see is not edited, not manipulated, it is raw, it is real, and it speaks for itself." Sophie felt her heart pound in her chest as Linda clicked the remote in her hand. The large screen at the front of the courtroom flickered to life, and the room grew still. The video began. It opened with the sound of a calm conversation between Karen and the family. You could hear Karen's condescending tone, the way she dismissed every word Jake and Sophie said. But it was the moment the officer had raised his weapon that sent a chill through the room. The camera zoomed in, showing the officer's hesitation, his hand trembling as he slowly pointed the gun toward Carly. The tension in the video was unbearable. Sophie could feel her pulse quicken as the next scene unfolded, the officer's finger tightening on the trigger. The gunshot was louder in the courtroom than it had ever been on the screen. The entire room seemed to freeze for a moment. The video showed Carly crumpling to the ground, her body lifeless in a second. Sophie watched the screen in a trance, but it was hard to ignore the tears that filled her eyes. She had relived that moment so many times, but watching it on the screen, in front of the world, made it feel like the first time all over again. Her daughter, her precious girl, had been taken from them in a moment of senseless violence. Karen's face on the screen was expressionless as she stood behind the officer, her eyes cold as the moment unfolded. Sophie's blood boiled. Karen's power, her reign of terror, had blinded her to the fact that her cruelty had consequences. The video ended, and the silence in the room was deafening. The impact of the footage seemed to linger in the air like a heavy weight, suffocating everyone. Karen's face had turned pale, her jaw clenched so tightly that Sophie could see the muscles in her neck twitch. She looked over at her lawyer, her fingers tightly gripping the arms of her chair. But she didn't speak, and for the first time, she didn't seem in control. The woman who had once seemed invincible was now reduced to a trembling shell of the person she had been only days ago. The jury was silent, their faces unreadable, but Sophie saw the way their eyes flicked between Karen and the screen. The evidence was undeniable. There was nowhere to hide. Karen's lawyer stood up, his voice sharp and defensive. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this video is incomplete. It's been selectively edited to fit the prosecution's narrative. What you didn't see was the danger that officer faced. He was forced to make a split-second decision. This wasn't murder, it was self-defense. Karen did not coerce Officer Trent into anything. The officer acted out of fear for his life." The defense lawyer's words echoed in the room, but Sophie could see that they were falling flat. The jury wasn't buying it. She could feel the shift in the air, the weight of the truth pressing down on the entire courtroom. Sophie glanced at Jake, his face pale but determined. He nodded, and she squeezed his hand, silently telling him that they were in this together. The judge, who had been silent through the exchange, cleared his throat and addressed the court. "The jury will consider all the evidence presented. However, it is clear from the footage that the officer did not act in self-defense. The actions we have seen on the video do not support that claim. The law is clear, excessive force is unacceptable, regardless of the circumstances." Karen's face tightened, and for the first time, Sophie saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. The woman who had spent so much time manipulating, controlling, and terrorizing the neighborhood was now faced with the consequences of her actions. Sophie knew this was only the beginning, but it felt like the first victory. It was the truth, and the truth was going to tear Karen's world apart. Officer Trent remained silent throughout the ordeal, his head hung low. The weight of his involvement in the shooting was impossible to ignore. He had taken an innocent life, and while Karen had led him to that point, the decision to pull the trigger was his alone. Sophie knew that while Karen might face the brunt of the punishment, Trent's conscience would haunt him for the rest of his life. The judge banged his gavel. "We will break for the day. The jury will deliberate, and closing statements will be heard tomorrow." As the courtroom began to empty, Sophie and Jake stood together, their hearts heavy but relieved. The truth had been shown, and there was no turning back. They had fought for justice, and now, finally, it was within reach. As they walked out of the courtroom, Sophie couldn't help but glance at Karen one last time. The woman who had killed their daughter with no remorse, who had tried to break their spirits, was now standing on the precipice of her own undoing. And Sophie? She felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The courtroom was quieter than it had ever been. The usual noise of papers shuffling, murmured conversations, and the shuffle of shoes across the floor was replaced by an eerie stillness. Sophie and Jake sat side by side, their fingers intertwined, their hearts heavy with anticipation. After weeks of testimony, tension, and raw emotion, the moment had arrived. The jury had returned with their verdict. The judge entered, his expression somber as he took his place at the bench. He looked at Karen, sitting in the defendant's chair, and then at the family, Sophie, Jake, and the small group of supporters they had gathered along the way. The judge's eyes briefly flickered toward Officer Trent, who sat nervously beside his lawyer. His hands were folded, his eyes fixed on the floor, his posture a sharp contrast to the man he had once been. The courtroom was filled with a collective breath, waiting for the judgment that would define their futures. "The jury has reached a verdict," the judge said, his voice steady but heavy. "In the case of the state versus Karen Brooks and Officer Trent Williams, we find the defendants guilty of manslaughter and excessive use of force. The actions that resulted in the death of Carly Harrow are unlawful, and justice must be served." The words echoed through the room, reverberating in Sophie's chest like a drumbeat. She felt her breath catch in her throat. It was over. The trial, the endless struggle to get the truth out, the fight to ensure their daughter wasn't forgotten, it was finally over. But the emotions were complex. The verdict didn't bring Carly back. It didn't erase the pain or the hole that would never heal. But it was justice. It was something. Jake's hand tightened around hers, and Sophie turned to him. There were no words. She didn't need any. His eyes said everything, the exhaustion, the relief, the overwhelming grief. But there was something else in those eyes now, a glimmer of closure. The truth had been spoken. And that was enough for now. The judge continued, explaining the terms of the sentencing. Karen would face 10 years for manslaughter, while Officer Trent would serve 5 years for his role in the shooting. The courtroom was quiet again, but Sophie and Jake stood up, their faces somber, but resolute. They hadn't won a simple victory. They hadn't won at all in the way people often thought of victory. What they had achieved wasn't a celebration, it was something deeper, something more sacred. Their daughter's death hadn't been in vain. The truth had come out, and now they could finally begin to move forward. After the verdict, the media frenzy only intensified. Cameras, reporters, and strangers crowded around them as they stepped outside the courthouse. Some offered words of encouragement, others shouted questions. Sophie and Jake ignored them all, focusing only on each other. Their journey wasn't over yet, but it was clear they were no longer the broken victims they had been at the beginning of this fight. As they drove home, the streets now familiar yet somehow foreign in their new reality, Sophie looked at Jake. She felt the weight of their daughter's absence, but she also felt something more. A quiet strength that had been forged through the fire of grief and injustice. They had fought for Carly's life, and in doing so, they had found a new sense of purpose. "I wish she was here," Sophie whispered, staring out of the window at the passing scenery. "But we did it, Jake. We made sure the world knew what happened." Jake nodded. "We did. And we're going to keep fighting. Not just for Carly, but for all the people who never get heard. For the ones who are pushed down by people like Karen." The days that followed were not easy. There were still moments of quiet grief, moments when the pain of their loss would hit them all over again. They went through Carly's things, the little treasures she had left behind, the drawings on the walls of her room. Every small, precious thing that reminded them of her. There were tears, but there were also quiet smiles. They would never get over the loss, but they were learning to live with it. Slowly, they started finding their footing again. Sophie started counseling sessions, and Jake began speaking out about police accountability and the dangers of unchecked authority. They became involved in activism, working to ensure that other families wouldn't have to go through what they had. They had suffered an unimaginable tragedy, but they would make sure Carly's story lived on in the fight for justice. Meanwhile, Karen's fall from grace was swift and unforgiving. Her once polished image as the perfect community leader had been shattered beyond repair. The neighborhood turned on her, demanding her resignation from the HOA board. The pressure from the public, the legal consequences, and the endless media attention pushed Karen further into isolation. Her fall was a stark reminder of the price of abusing power. Officer Trent's punishment, while less severe, carried its own consequences. His involvement in Carly's death would haunt him for the rest of his life. While he had been coerced by Karen, he still pulled the trigger. And though his punishment was far less than what Karen faced, he would live with the knowledge that his actions had taken an innocent life. His future was uncertain, filled with regret and unanswered questions. Sophie and Jake didn't feel victorious, not in the traditional sense. There was no triumph in this story. The victory wasn't one of celebration, it was one of survival. They had faced the unthinkable and come out on the other side. They had fought not just for their daughter's justice, but for their own healing, for the possibility of finding peace in a world that often seemed cruel and unfair. As the days passed, the memories of Carly stayed with them, not as ghosts of the past, but as a source of strength. Sophie would look at Jake, and in the quiet moments when they were alone, she would whisper, "We did it, Carly. We did it for you." And though the scars of their loss would never fade, they were no longer weighed down by the same overwhelming grief. Their fight had given them purpose, and with that purpose, they would continue to honor Carly's memory. They had faced the impossible, and they had survived. Sophie and Jake sat together on the porch, the warmth of the sun casting a gentle glow over their faces. The world around them had quieted, the chaos of the trial and the public scrutiny finally fading into the background. But the silence was no longer oppressive. It was a peaceful kind of quiet, the kind that comes after a storm has passed and the first rays of light peek through the clouds. As they sat there, side by side, Sophie couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. They had been broken once, lost in the overwhelming grief and fear that came from losing their daughter in such a senseless, violent way. But now, they were something else. They were no longer just victims of Karen's cruelty. They had found their voice, their strength. And in that, they had reclaimed a part of themselves they had thought was lost forever. Jake squeezed her hand gently, his voice soft but steady. "We didn't just survive, Soph," he said. "We thrived. This fight, it changed us." She nodded, looking out over the quiet street. "We found our voice. We found our power. And no one can take that from us." It was true. They had fought not just for Carly, but for their own healing. They had fought to show the world that they weren't just passive observers in their own tragedy. They had taken control of their story, and in doing so, they had taken back their dignity. They had shown that justice, no matter how long it took, could still prevail. As the wind rustled the leaves around them, Sophie felt a sense of peace settle over her. The journey hadn't been easy. It hadn't been without its cost. But they had emerged stronger, more resilient. Their daughter's memory would forever be a part of them, and they would continue to live in a way that honored her. They didn't just survive, they thrived. They found their voice, their truth. And nothing could take that away. And that truth was this: no matter what darkness they had faced, they had never lost the light that was within them. This story isn't just about a fight for justice, it's about standing up against the odds and finding your voice when everything seems lost. If you believe in standing up for what's right, share this video with your friends and family. Comment below and tell us how you fought for justice or what this story has meant to you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful, real-life stories that show the strength of the human spirit. We all have a part to play in creating a world where justice prevails. Let's keep the conversation going, because together, we can make a difference. Justice isn't just a right, it's a fight. Let's continue the battle, together.